The most painful part of being laughed at by your own family is realizing they practiced it before you even walked into the room. I still remember standing in front of the large wooden door of my parents' house that Thanksgiving afternoon, holding a small gift bag that suddenly felt completely out of place in my hands. My name is Hannah Collins, and I had driven nearly 40 minutes through light holiday traffic across suburban Massachusetts just to be here, telling myself that this year would be different. The air outside was cold enough to make my breath visible, and I paused for a moment before ringing the doorbell, noticing how the house already looked full of life through the curtains, warm lights glowing inside, silhouettes moving around what I assumed was a familiar, ordinary family gathering. When the door finally opened, I was greeted not by my mother or father, but by my Aunt Linda, who smiled politely but briefly before stepping aside without saying my name. The moment I entered, I immediately felt the difference in atmosphere compared to what I had hoped for. The house was beautifully decorated for Thanksgiving, with a long dining table set in the formal dining room, white candles placed evenly along the center, and the smell of roasted turkey filling every corner. At first glance, it looked perfect, like something out of a holiday advertisement. That perfection has a strange way of feeling wrong when you are not included in it properly. My father was in the kitchen speaking to a few guests, his voice confident and relaxed in the way it always was when he was performing for an audience. My mother moved between rooms, greeting people with a practiced warmth that seemed slightly sharper when she passed by me without stopping. I tried to tell myself I was overthinking things, that maybe they were just busy hosting, that Thanksgiving always made people a little scattered. I placed my gift bag on a small side table near the entrance and quietly followed the sound of conversation into the dining area. That was when I first noticed how the guests were arranged. There were about 14 people in total, seated or standing in clusters that clearly revolved around conversation groups my family had already formed. Some I recognized as distant relatives, others as neighbors or family friends I had only met a few times before. I smiled politely at a few of them, receiving quick nods in return, but something about the way I was being looked at felt unfamiliar, like I had arrived after a story had already started without me. My sister, Emily, appeared near the dining table wearing a dress that matched the warm tones of the room perfectly. She looked confident, comfortable, and fully at ease in the environment in a way that made me feel slightly out of sync just standing there in my simple coat. She hugged me briefly, but the hug felt mechanical, more like a formality than a greeting. "You made it," she said, as if my presence had been uncertain until that moment. I laughed lightly, though something in my chest tightened slightly. "Of course I did," I replied, trying to match her energy. But as I looked around the room again, I noticed something I could not immediately place. The conversation seemed to pause slightly when I moved closer. Not completely, but just enough to make me aware that I was not part of the flow. I took a seat at the edge of the living room, near the transition into the dining space, and watched as my mother coordinated final details for the meal. She moved with authority, directing people, adjusting plates, and smiling at guests with an ease that made her seem like she belonged everywhere at once. When she finally looked in my direction, her expression softened for only a moment before shifting back into something more neutral, almost distant. I told myself again that I was imagining it, that holidays were stressful, that I was simply reading too much into small gestures. But as more guests arrived and the house filled with louder conversation, I began to notice that I was being introduced differently than others. Not by name. Not with familiarity. But with hesitation, as if my place in the room was not yet clearly defined. And somewhere in that slow realization, before anything had even been said out loud, I began to feel that tonight was not going to be the kind of Thanksgiving I had been expecting. The dining room began to fill more completely as the evening progressed, and I found myself shifting between small pockets of conversation that never fully included me. It was not that anyone was openly hostile. In fact, everything appeared polite on the surface, carefully constructed in the way family gatherings often are when guests are present. But beneath that surface, I began to notice a pattern that was difficult to ignore. When introductions were made, names were exchanged clearly for everyone except me. When questions were asked about who had arrived, explanations seemed to skip over my presence as if I was already categorized somewhere that did not require clarification. He stayed seated near the edge of the living area, holding a glass of water that I barely drank from, watching as my mother moved through the room with increasing confidence as the host. She laughed at the right moments, touched guests on the shoulder in greeting, and positioned herself naturally at the center of attention without ever needing to announce it. My father stood near the dining table, speaking with a few relatives about work and travel, his voice steady and familiar in the way that suggested he was used to controlling the tone of the environment. At one point, I tried to join a conversation between two distant cousins who were discussing holiday plans, but there was a brief pause when I approached, followed by a subtle shift in direction that moved the topic elsewhere. It was small enough that no one could be accused of anything specific, but consistent enough that I could no longer dismiss it as coincidence. My sister, Emily, moved freely between rooms, occasionally glancing in my direction but never lingering long enough to create connection. She seemed completely comfortable in the structure of the evening, as if every person here already understood their role except me. He began to notice how often people looked at my mother for cues before addressing me, as though waiting for permission that was never explicitly given. Even simple questions like where I had been living recently or what I had been doing after college were redirected before I could answer them. Fully. He answered politely when spoken to, keeping my tone light, trying not to disrupt the rhythm of the evening, but inside I started to feel a slow accumulation of uncertainty. It was not anger yet. It was something quieter, like observation turning into recognition. At one point, I overheard my mother speaking to a group of guests near the dining table. Her voice was warm, confident, and slightly performative in the way people speak when they are presenting a story they have told before. He did not hear everything clearly at first, but I caught enough to realize she was introducing people in the room, placing names and relationships into a structure that made sense to her audience. When she reached a pause, I saw her gesture slightly in my direction. A few heads turned. Conversation slowed for a moment. He straightened slightly, expecting her to call my name, expecting the familiar introduction that would confirm my place in the room. Instead, there was a brief pause, followed by a sentence that I did not immediately process. A label. Not a name. A description that did not match who I believed I was within this family. He felt my expression freeze for a moment, though I did not move or respond outwardly. Around the room, I noticed subtle reactions from the guests, small shifts in posture, brief glances exchanged between people who were unsure how to interpret what they had just heard. The atmosphere changed slightly, not dramatically, but enough that the room no longer felt the same as it had minutes before. He turned my gaze toward my mother, expecting her to correct it, to clarify, to laugh it off as a mistake. But she did not. She simply continued speaking as if the introduction was accurate and complete. In that moment, I became aware of something that went beyond embarrassment or misunderstanding. It was the realization that the way I was being presented to this room had been decided before I ever arrived, and the silence that followed it was not confusion. It was confirmation. The moment my mother's words settled into the room, I felt a shift that was difficult to describe as anything other than collective hesitation. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was the kind of silence that happens when people recognize something is slightly off but are not yet certain whether they are allowed to react. He remained standing near the edge of the living room, close enough to hear conversations but far enough that I no longer felt included in them. My name had not been used. Instead, I had been assigned a label that did not belong to me, spoken in the same tone my mother used when introducing caterers or service staff earlier in the evening. At first, I thought I had misheard her. I waited for her to correct herself, to laugh, to clarify that it was a joke or a mistake. But she did not. Instead, she continued speaking to the guests as if the introduction had been completely normal, as if nothing about it required explanation. He turned my head slightly and looked at the nearest group of guests. A few of them were smiling awkwardly, unsure whether to continue the conversation or acknowledge what had just been said. One woman glanced at me briefly before quickly looking away, as if making eye contact might turn the moment into something more uncomfortable than it already was. My father stood near the dining table, continuing a separate conversation as if the introduction had not interrupted anything at all. My sister, Emily, was closer to the center of the room, her expression carefully neutral, but her posture suggested she was aware of exactly what had just happened. He noticed that no one stepped in to clarify. No one corrected the statement. And that absence of correction began to feel heavier than the statement itself. He slowly sat down again, not because I wanted to, but because standing felt increasingly out of place in a room where my presence had already been redefined without my consent. He tried to focus on the conversation happening at the nearby couch, where two relatives were discussing Thanksgiving travel plans, but even that felt distant now, like I was listening from behind a thin barrier. Every so often, someone would glance in my direction, then quickly return to their conversation, as if acknowledging me too directly might disrupt the fragile balance of the evening. He began to notice how carefully my mother managed the flow of attention in the room. When she moved between groups, she subtly redirected conversations away from me. When someone appeared about to ask me a direct question, she would interject with a comment that shifted focus elsewhere. It was subtle enough that it could be dismissed individually, but together it formed a pattern that I could no longer ignore. I started to understand that the label she had used was not an accident in speech. It functioned as a boundary. It defined where I stood in the structure of the evening, and more importantly, where I did not belong. My throat tightened slightly, but I forced myself to remain calm. He did not want to give the room any reason to interpret my reaction as instability or exaggeration. He reached for my glass of water again, though my hand felt slightly unsteady as I lifted it. Around me, the dinner preparations continued. Plats were being arranged, chairs adjusted, conversations overlapping in soft layers that pretended normalcy. But beneath all of it, I could feel a subtle fragmentation forming, like the evening had split into two versions of reality. In one version, this was a typical Thanksgiving gathering. In the other, I was no longer being recognized in the way I had expected to be recognized by my own family. He looked again toward my mother, hoping for even a brief moment of acknowledgement that something had gone wrong. She was laughing with the guests now, her expression warm and composed, completely unshaken by what had just occurred. That was when I understood something that settled in slowly but firmly. This was not a misunderstanding waiting to be corrected. It was a presentation already finalized. And I had arrived too late to be part of how it was prepared. The atmosphere in the room continued to function as if nothing had shifted, yet I could feel a subtle but undeniable change in how I was being positioned within it. Conversations resumed their natural flow, laughter returned in short bursts, and plates were passed around as the Thanksgiving dinner preparation reached its final stage. But I was no longer part of that flow in the same way I had been when I first arrived. He remained seated near the edge of the living area, watching the interactions around me with a growing sense of detachment that I was trying not to let surface outwardly. Every time someone spoke, I noticed whether they acknowledged me directly or indirectly avoided doing so, and more often than not, it was the latter. My mother moved confidently through the space, now fully in control of the evening's rhythm. She spoke to guests with ease, guided conversations, and subtly shaped how people engaged with each other. When she passed near me, she did not stop, but I felt her awareness of my presence as something she actively chose not to engage with. My father remained closer to the dining area, occasionally laughing with guests, maintaining the kind of composed authority that suggested everything unfolding was still within his control. My sister, Emily, was seated at the table now, speaking with two relatives as if the earlier moment had not created any disruption at all. I found myself observing not just what was being said, but how carefully nothing was being addressed. There was a deliberate absence of correction, as if acknowledging the introduction from earlier would require a shift in the entire structure of the evening that no one was willing to initiate. At one point, I heard a guest near me quietly ask another who I was, and before the question could fully develop, my mother appeared beside them and smoothly redirected the conversation toward Thanksgiving recipes and travel plans. It was subtle, almost invisible in execution, but unmistakable in intention. He began to understand that the label had not been a mistake or a momentary lapse in speech. It was functioning as a boundary that had already been accepted by the room, even if unspoken. He adjusted my posture slightly, trying to remain composed, though I could feel a growing awareness that I was being observed differently than everyone else in the space. Not openly judged, but quietly categorized in a way that required no further explanation. The guests continued to eat, drink, and converse, but I noticed that whenever I was near a group, the tone of conversation would shift slightly, becoming more generalized, less personal, as if my presence introduced an uncertainty that people were unconsciously trying to avoid. He picked up my glass again, though I was no longer particularly interested in drinking from it. The simple act of holding it gave me something to focus on that was not the room itself. My mind kept returning to the moment my mother had spoken earlier, the ease with which she had assigned me a role that did not match my reality, and the complete absence of correction that followed. It was not just what she said that mattered, but how quickly the room adapted to it without resistance. That adaptation was what unsettled me most. He tried to rationalize it internally, to consider whether this was some form of misunderstanding, social awkwardness, or a poorly executed joke that had simply gone too far without being acknowledged. But none of those explanations held up against the consistency of what I was now observing. People were not confused. They were responding as if the framework had already been established and they were simply operating within it. He glanced toward my mother again, hoping to catch some indication that she recognized the impact of what had been said earlier. Instead, I saw her smiling comfortably across the room, engaged in conversation with a group of guests who appeared entirely at ease in her presence. There was no visible sign that she was reconsidering anything. That realization created a quiet heaviness in my chest, not sharp or dramatic, but persistent. He began to understand that the evening was not structured around inclusion that I had lost access to. It was structured around a version of reality that had been decided before I entered the room. And within that structure, my role had already been assigned without my participation. As the evening continued toward the moment everyone seemed to be preparing for the Thanksgiving meal, I found myself increasingly aware that I was no longer being positioned as an equal participant in the room. Instead, I was observing the structure of the gathering from a distance, even while physically present within it. The dining table was now fully set, with carefully arranged dishes, polished silverware, and warm lighting that gave the entire space a controlled sense of comfort. Guests began transitioning toward their seats, guided naturally by my mother, who appeared to direct the flow of the evening without needing to explicitly announce any instructions. He remained near the side of the living room, waiting for a moment where I could naturally join the table, but that moment never seemed to arrive. Instead, I noticed how seating arrangements formed without my inclusion being addressed. Conversations shifted as chairs were filled, and spaces filled themselves in a way that subtly left me on the outside edge of the gathering. My father took a seat at the head of the table, speaking briefly with a few guests nearby, his tone relaxed and confident as if everything unfolding was proceeding exactly as planned. My sister, Emily, sat comfortably among relatives, leaning into conversations that felt familiar and established, while I remained standing slightly apart, holding on to the last trace of expectation that I might still be naturally called into the group. That expectation faded when I heard my mother's voice again, this time from across the room, addressing someone near the table in a casual tone. She was organizing final placements, confirming who would sit where, and adjusting details with the ease of someone fully in control of the environment. He waited for her to acknowledge my position, even indirectly, but instead I noticed a subtle continuation of what had begun earlier. My presence was not being directly refused, but it was not being actively included either. It existed in a space of deliberate ambiguity that forced me to interpret my own place without guidance. I moved slightly closer to the dining area, attempting to integrate myself naturally into the group as conversations continued to develop. A few guests glanced at me briefly, then returned to their discussions without pause. The flow of the room did not stop, but it did not fully open either. It simply continued around me. My mother passed by again, speaking to another guest about serving timing and meal preparation. When she reached the center of the room, she paused. Briefly, scanning the table as if ensuring everything was in order. Her eyes moved past me without acknowledgement, not in hostility, but in a way that felt more structured than emotional. It was as if my placement had already been accounted for in a system that no longer required active discussion. I felt a quiet tightening in my chest as I realized I was still waiting for something that was not going to happen naturally. There would be no invitation that clarified my position. No correction that restored my name into the flow of the evening. The structure had already absorbed me into its margins without needing to explain how or why. I looked toward the table again, watching as conversations continued, laughter rising and falling in natural cycles that I was no longer part of. I could hear my own thoughts more clearly than any of the voices around me now, and in that clarity, I began to understand that the earlier label had not been an isolated moment of embarrassment. It had been a definition. And everything that followed had been the room adjusting itself to that definition without resistance. I remained standing for a moment longer, observing the scene as if trying to locate a point of entry that still existed. But the longer I watched, the more apparent it became that the evening had already stabilized into a version of reality where my presence did not need to be actively included to continue. And in that realization, I understood that what I was experiencing was not confusion, not misunderstanding, and not temporary discomfort. It was structure. A structure that had already decided where I belonged before I ever sat down. The moment the Thanksgiving dinner officially began, the atmosphere in the room shifted into a more structured formality, as if everyone collectively agreed to transition from casual conversation into a shared performance of tradition. Plates were served, chairs adjusted, and voices rose in overlapping layers of conversation that filled the dining room with warmth that felt carefully constructed rather than naturally spontaneous. I remained standing near the edge of the room for a few seconds longer than I should have, observing how quickly everyone had settled into their assigned places. It was not that there was an explicit barrier preventing me from sitting. It was that no space had been actively created for me within the flow of seating. My mother moved through the room with a sense of control that was almost invisible unless you were paying close attention. She ensured everyone had what they needed, directed small adjustments in seating, and engaged guests with a steady confidence that reinforced her role as the center of the gathering. When she passed near me again, I expected at least a glance, some indication of acknowledgement that would allow me to step forward into the table arrangement. Instead, she continued moving without pause, speaking to another guest about serving timing and dish coordination, as if my position required no immediate attention. I finally approached the table more directly, attempting to find an opening between conversations. A few chairs were technically unoccupied, but the energy of the space made it clear that those seats had already been socially accounted for. As I hesitated, I noticed subtle reactions from those seated nearby. Not hostility. No rejection. Something more passive. A brief shift in posture. A slight pause in conversation that resumed just as quickly. It was the kind of response that did not require words to communicate its meaning. I remained standing for a moment longer, scanning the table, trying to determine where I was expected to place myself. My father was seated comfortably at the head of the table, engaged in conversation with two guests, his tone relaxed and authoritative in the way that suggested he was fully in control of the environment. My sister, Emily, sat among relatives, laughing softly at something being said, her posture relaxed and integrated into the group dynamic as if she had always belonged exactly where she was placed. No one looked toward me with clarity of invitation. Instead, I began to notice something more subtle. When I stood near certain sections of the table, conversations would slightly shift direction. Topics would change mid-sentence. Eye contact would briefly flicker away. It was not coordinated, but it was consistent enough that I could no longer dismiss it as coincidence. My presence seemed to create a kind of unspoken uncertainty that the room instinctively adjusted around. I took a slow breath and tried to remain composed, telling myself that I was overinterpreting social dynamics, that perhaps I simply needed to choose a seat and join without waiting for formal inclusion. But even as I considered that, I realized that the difficulty was not logistical. It was relational. I was not being physically prevented from sitting. I was being socially unpositioned within the structure of the evening. My mother returned to the table area again, this time overseeing final adjustments before everyone began eating. She spoke briefly to a guest about portioning and serving order, then glanced across the room as if confirming that everything was aligned with her expectations. Her eyes passed over me again without stopping, and in that moment I understood that this was not oversight. It was continuity. A continuation of the framework that had already been established earlier in the evening. He slowly stepped back from the immediate edge of the dining area and stood near the living room threshold again, observing the table from a distance. The sound of conversation, clinking dishes, and laughter continued uninterrupted, but my perception of it had changed. It was no longer a single unified gathering that included everyone equally. It was a structured environment with defined roles that had already been assigned, whether spoken or unspoken. And within that structure, I began to recognize that my place had not been forgotten. It had simply been predetermined in a way that did not require my input or acknowledgement to function. As the Thanksgiving dinner fully transitioned into active serving and conversation, I remained standing near the edge of the dining area, no longer trying to force myself into the natural flow of the table but instead observing it with a clarity that felt increasingly uncomfortable. The sound of utensils meeting plates, the overlapping voices of guests, and the warm but structured rhythm of a traditional family meal all continued without interruption. Yet I was no longer part of that rhythm in any meaningful sense. I noticed how everyone else had already settled into defined positions, not only physically at the table but socially within the dynamics of conversation. Certain people leaned toward each other with familiarity, others deferred naturally to my parents when speaking, and even small exchanges seemed to follow an unspoken hierarchy that I was no longer clearly included in. My mother moved around the table area with quiet authority, ensuring that food was served properly, that guests were comfortable, and that conversations remained balanced. She spoke with ease, laughed when appropriate, and maintained a presence that subtly anchored the entire environment. But she still did not acknowledge me directly in any way that would re-establish my place in the structure she had created. My father remained seated at the head of the table, occasionally speaking to guests with calm assurance, reinforcing the sense that everything unfolding was normal and controlled. My sister, Emily, appeared fully integrated into the social energy of the gathering, laughing and engaging in conversation without hesitation, her position within the room completely secure. I, however, remained slightly outside of that structure, still physically present but no longer socially anchored. He slowly stepped closer to the table again, attempting to identify a natural point of entry where I could sit without disrupting the flow of the evening. But every seat seemed already defined by subtle expectations that were not spoken aloud. When I moved near one side of the table, conversations shifted slightly. When I paused near another, there was a brief moment of hesitation before the group adjusted their focus elsewhere. It was not overt rejection, but it was consistent enough to make me aware that my presence was being managed in real time without direct confrontation. He pulled a chair back slightly, then stopped, realizing that even this simple action felt uncertain in a way it should not have. He was beginning to understand that the difficulty was not about finding space at the table. It was about whether space had been created for me at all within the structure of the evening. My mother passed behind me again, speaking to a guest about serving timing and meal coordination. Her tone remained warm and composed, and she did not look at me as she moved past. That absence of acknowledgement felt more defining than anything that had been said earlier. It confirmed that my earlier introduction, the label spoken in front of everyone, had not been corrected because it had not been intended to be temporary. It was functioning as part of the framework of the evening. I stepped back slightly from the dining table, allowing myself a moment to simply observe without attempting to insert myself into the flow of the room. From this distance, the structure became more visible. The room was not chaotic. It was organized. Conversations were not random. They followed patterns of familiarity and authority. Even laughter seemed to rise and fall around specific clusters of people who were already fully integrated into the social rhythm of the gathering. And within that structure, my position remained undefined. Not excluded in a loud or aggressive way, but left unassigned in a system that did not require explanation to function. I realized then that no one in the room was actively discussing where I should be because, in their perception, that decision had already been made earlier. My presence did not require placement because it had already been interpreted and absorbed into the social structure of the evening in a way that did not need to be revisited. I stood quietly, watching the dinner continue without me needing to be acknowledged in order for it to proceed. And in that silence of inclusion without recognition, I began to understand that the most powerful part of the evening was not what had been said about me. It was how quickly everyone had learned to continue as if that definition had always been true. As the Thanksgiving dinner reached its most active point, with food being served and conversations overlapping across the dining table, I found myself standing just outside the full circle of participation, observing what had now become a clearly structured social environment that I was not. Seamlessly part of the earlier sense of confusion had faded, replaced by a quieter and more analytical awareness of how the evening was being organized around me. Every movement in the room now appeared intentional in a way I had not fully recognized before. Chairs had been filled in a pattern that reinforced familiarity. Conversations formed clusters that naturally excluded disruption. Even the flow of passing dishes and passing comments followed an invisible structure that I could observe but not easily enter. My mother remained in motion, ensuring everything functioned smoothly. She spoke across the table with ease, responding to guests, adjusting small details of the meal, and maintaining a presence that kept the entire environment stable. Yet she continued to avoid any direct engagement with me that would re-establish my position within the group. It was not confrontation. It was absence of correction. And that absence now felt more deliberate than anything that had been explicitly stated earlier in the evening. My father, seated at the head of the table, continued to engage in conversation with calm authority, reinforcing the sense that the gathering was proceeding exactly as intended. My sister, Emily, was fully integrated into the social rhythm, participating without hesitation, her presence reinforcing the natural separation that had formed between her position and mine. I remained near the edge of the dining area, no longer attempting to force my way into conversations but instead studying how easily the room continued without requiring my participation. At one point, a brief silence passed through part of the table as a dish was placed down, and in that moment I stepped slightly closer again, testing whether the pause would create space for me to join. But the conversation resumed immediately in the same formation, flowing around my position without interruption. It was subtle, but unmistakable. The structure of the room did not collapse or resist my presence. It simply continued as if my participation was not necessary for its continuation. I noticed how even eye contact became selective. Some guests briefly acknowledged me when I was directly in their line of sight, but no one extended that acknowledgement into conversation. It ended at recognition without invitation. My mother passed by once more, speaking softly to a guest about serving portions and timing for dessert. Her voice was steady, composed, and entirely focused on the management of the evening. She did not glance in my direction. That continued absence of acknowledgement reinforced a realization that had been forming throughout the night. What had been spoken earlier in the evening had not been corrected because it had not been interpreted as an error within the structure of the gathering. Eat had been absorbed. He stepped back again, this time not out of hesitation, but out of observation. From a slightly greater distance, the pattern of the evening became clearer. The table was not simply a place where people gathered to eat. It was a system of social placement, where roles were understood implicitly and maintained without need for explanation. Within that system, my position had been defined early and had not been revisited since. There was no visible effort to reinforce it. There was no need. The structure maintained itself through repetition and silence. He realized that my expectation of inclusion had been based on a belief that participation in a family gathering was automatically mutual. But what I was witnessing was something more rigid. A structure where inclusion was not assumed, but assigned. And once assigned, it did not require ongoing acknowledgement to remain in effect. I stood quietly, listening to the layered sounds of the room. Laughter, conversation, movement, and the subtle rhythm of a dinner continuing without interruption. And within that continuity, I understood something that no longer felt speculative. My presence in the room was not being actively resisted. It was simply not being integrated. And in that distinction, I began to see the full shape of the evening more clearly than I had at any point before. As the Thanksgiving dinner reached its final stretch, the atmosphere in the dining room had fully stabilized into a structured rhythm that no longer shifted or adjusted in any meaningful way around my presence. Plates were being cleared, conversations continued in overlapping clusters, and the sound of soft laughter and polite exchanges filled the space with a sense of completion that felt entirely independent of whether I was included in it or not. He remained standing near the edge of the room for a moment longer than before, not because I expected anything to change, but because I was beginning to understand that waiting itself no longer served any purpose within the structure that had formed. My mother moved through the dining area with calm efficiency, speaking to guests, coordinating final details of the meal, and maintaining full control of the social environment without ever needing to reference or correct anything that had been said earlier about me. That earlier moment, the introduction that had assigned me a role I did not recognize, had not been revisited, and its silence now felt more definitive than the statement itself. My father remained seated at the head of the table, engaged in conversation with steady confidence, as if the evening had proceeded exactly as intended from beginning to end. My sister, Emily, continued to participate naturally within the group, her position in the room fully integrated and unquestioned. He, however, stood outside the completed structure, observing it not as a participant trying to enter, but as someone finally recognizing the boundaries that had already been established. He slowly moved closer to the table one last time, not with expectation, but with curiosity about whether the structure would allow any variation in its final state. Our conversation paused briefly as I approached, then resumed in a slightly adjusted direction that did not include me. It was not rejection in an active sense. It was continuation without adjustment. That distinction became increasingly clear to me as I watched how effortlessly the room maintained its flow regardless of my position within it. He noticed how even the remaining interactions among guests had settled into familiar patterns, with no further need for introductions or clarifications. Everyone present seemed to understand where they belonged within the evening, except for me, whose position had already been defined earlier and never revised. My mother passed by once more near the end of the room, briefly checking on final details before the meal concluded. She did not pause, did not acknowledge me, and did not signal any shift in the structure that had been established. In that continued absence of correction, I began to understand that what I had been waiting for throughout the evening was not a misunderstanding being resolved, but a framework that had already completed itself without my participation. He stepped back slowly, allowing myself to observe the full table one final time. The conversations, the laughter, the movement of plates being cleared, all of it continued in a seamless flow that no longer required adjustment. The gathering was no longer forming. It had already formed. And within that completed structure, my role was not missing or forgotten. It was simply not part of what had been built. That realization settled in quietly, without confrontation or disruption, but with a clarity that could not be easily dismissed. He turned slightly away from the table, not out of anger or reaction, but out of recognition that the evening had reached its natural conclusion without ever needing to redefine my place within it. And as I stood there, I understood fully that what had happened was not a moment of exclusion in real time, but a system that had already been finalized long before I noticed it.